Guided by science. The science was open and shut. On one side was almost the entire international scientific establishment. On the other, a few cranks and conspiracy theorists. One scholar had proposed a radical idea, but most of his colleagues ignored it, though they did value the groundbreaking techniques he had developed to support it. A few fringe thinkers thought he might be onto something, but there were still overwhelming evidential problems. So when a prominent figure wrote a book rubbishing the accepted science and ridiculing powerful people who subscribed to it, the backlash was inevitable. Galileo had to go. When governments claim to be guided by the science, what does that mean? We've heard it a lot lately, but it's not new. When I worked in the UK civil service in the noughties, the mantra was evidence-based policy. That sounds reasonable. Who wouldn't want their policies to be based on evidence? But that ignores how evidence is created and presented, how science is and has always been done. In hindsight, we can see Galileo was right. The Earth really does go round the sun. But at the time the evidence was stacked against him, and it would stay that way for another 50 years. Yet the myth persists that Galileo was persecuted by blind church authority. It persists because we cling to a fantasy view of science. In this fantasy, a few great men drive progress through a series of eureka moments, wowing the bit-part plodders of science with their visionary genius. Anyone who doesn't immediately fall into line is a dinosaur and deserves their fate. Galileo, the reckless self-promoter who wound up his friend the Pope, is a household name, while Tycho Brahe, who laid the foundations for modern astronomy with his mind-blowingly accurate observations, but didn't think the Earth rotates, is known only to history buffs. In reality, experts often legitimately disagree, and science develops through debate and challenge. This doesn't discredit science, it just makes it more interesting. But it also presents challenges for policymakers needing to make decisions in real time. Politicians, so often trained in the humanities, need to understand and assess the quality of scientific advice. Voters, drowning in boasts and slogans, need the tools to tell the difference between political decision-making and scientific consensus building. As schools and universities, like all our institutions, begin to envisage their status and shape in the post-COVID world, the calls to focus on science have got louder. STEM will secure our children's jobs in an uncertain world, say the same politicians who never paid much attention in physics class. They may be right. But alongside science, our future workers, voters, policymakers, and yes, scientists need to learn how science really works. They need to study the history and philosophy of science. The history of science teaches that just when we think we know almost all there is to be known, we discover the extent of our ignorance. It teaches that other people and cultures, including people in the past, aren't as stupid as it might comfort us to believe. It teaches that the best ideas can come from the strangest places. Modern genetics, for example, is built on the work of an obscure Moravian friar, Gregor Mendel. Even past ideas that now seem silly, like the humoral theory of health and disease, were often based on solid logic. Hot, dry, yellow bile, seated in the gallbladder, ruled by Mars and inclining choleric individuals towards reckless anger. That might provoke ridicule, but studied sensitively, in its full subtlety and complexity, it could also inspire respect. Taught properly, children come to see science not as a list of dry facts, but as an incredible creative enterprise. Medieval medicine is not something to laugh at, but should elicit humility, empathy, and wonder. Science is the inspiring process by which people have explored and built understandings of the world around them. It's humanity's greatest achievement. Why don't we learn that history in school? When kids are told about the warlike Vikings descending in their longships on the defenceless monasteries of Lindisfarne and Jarrow, why don't they learn that the monks in those monasteries were developing new methods of computing the calendar based on advanced maths and astronomy? the potential of doing things another way is enormous. Long division becomes a lot more exciting when you're doing it with an axe-wielding Norseman breathing down your neck. In one South London comprehensive school, where maths and history were taught in parallel, pupils gained deeper knowledge and enjoyed the subject more too. By covering the same subject from two opposite angles, the 11 and 12-year-olds in the programme developed flexibility of thinking and saved time too. Of course, such changes would add to the workload of already overburdened teachers. As a former teacher myself, I can empathise. Not all history teachers would feel comfortable refreshing their charges' knowledge of trigonometry while teaching about the ancient Greece of Pythagoras and Euclid. But that discomfort is a relic of a mentality that sees science and the humanities as two utterly distinct cultures, a world in which every educated person can quote at least a few lines of Shakespeare, but very few can even outline the all-important second law of thermodynamics. Go and look for a history of science book in most bookshops, and you won't find it on the history shelves, if one's available at all. You'll find it with the textbooks and self-help guides in the science corner. Art, religion, politics, war, they all count as part of human history. But science? Science is something separate, they seem to say. This tumultuous year has seen both a generational scientific challenge and an urgent fight for racial and social justice. Some commentators have worried that the latter is a distraction from the former. Propositions to decolonise science curriculums are, they fear, a politicisation of pure, disinterested science. They needn't worry. Science has always been political. As long as it's been a human activity, it's had human flaws. It's been shaped and sometimes distorted by vested interests, from Plato's geocentric cosmology to 20th century eugenics. And yes, science has exploited and excluded certain groups in the past, and it continues to do so. Understanding that is the first step towards maximising its potential. As a woman in Germany in the late 1600s, Maria Sibylla Merian was excluded from many scientific circles. She had to travel across the ocean to South America to pursue her studies of animals and plants. But there she was able to exploit and extend the latest copperplate engraving techniques to produce biological images that were both highly scientific and stunning works of art. You'd be hard-pressed to find a schoolchild who's heard of her. They're too busy learning about the wars and destruction we humans have inflicted on each other. When you consider what kids are taught, it's hardly surprising that narrow nationalism has got in the way of the world's pandemic response, that pessimism is the collective mood of the times. What if they learned about the history of science instead? An international collaborative history in which the advances of the Renaissance were based on ideas from India and the Islamic world, in which as far back as the 1200s, scholars from different countries were collaborating on scientific problems in a common language, Latin, in the newly founded universities. Scholars working on philosophical problems in Oxford, developing techniques that Galileo could harness for his groundbreaking physics. Now that would be a history to be proud of, a history to emulate.